Marcus Delaney sat in his dimly lit study, a scotch swirling lazily in his hand. The glass reflected the soft glow of his laptop screen, where Evelyn's calendar remained open, a glaring anomaly in her otherwise meticulous habits. His wife had always been cautious, bordering on secretive, but lately her behavior had shifted. Late nights, vague explanations, hushed phone calls. Tonight, the unease was a steady drumbeat in his chest. A chime broke the silence. A notification. An email she hadn't logged out of. His hand hesitated over the trackpad, a pang of guilt flashing across his face. But curiosity and doubt pushed him forward. The subject line read, Phase 2 approved. Inside, the cryptic body of the message was worse. The transfer will be finalized by Friday. Ensure all documents are secure. Marcus froze, his mind racing. Transfer. Documents. Who was this sender? PCL. He felt the chill of betrayal prick at the edges of his conscience. Evelyn's laughter echoed faintly from downstairs, mingling with the hum of their dinner guests. She sounded at ease, carefree even. But Marcus knew the voice of someone hiding something. His throat tightened as he closed the email and cleared her browsing history. The evening dragged on, every polite laugh and clink of glasses feeling hollow. Evelyn's emerald dress shimmered under the chandelier as she moved between their guests. Her radiant smile was practiced, perfected. Marcus barely tasted the wine in his hand. How long had it been since he truly knew the woman he married? As the final guests left, Evelyn approached him, her expression soft. Thank you for being patient tonight. I know these events bore you. Not at all, Marcus replied, his tone neutral. Her hand brushed his arm, a small gesture he used to treasure, but now it felt rehearsed. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Evelyn's eyes flicked to the screen, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. She quickly pressed it to her side, glancing at Marcus. Just a client, she murmured, the lie almost convincing. Marcus forced a smile. Busy as ever, Evelyn nodded, leaning in to kiss his cheek. Always. I'll be upstairs in a minute. She disappeared down the hall, leaving Marcus alone with the faint scent of her perfume. He clenched his jaw, the cold suspicion creeping deeper. That message wasn't from a client, and her polished demeanor tonight? Too perfect. Sleep eluded him. Hours later, Marcus found himself in his study again, staring at the email thread he'd forwarded to himself. The sender's email was masked, but PCL stirred a memory. Peter Calloway. The name nagged at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. Peter had been a client of Evelyn's interior design business, a man Marcus had met briefly at one of her showcases. He was charismatic, the kind of man who took up too much space in a room. Could Peter be involved in this? Marcus leaned back in his chair, the weight of doubt settling on him like an anchor. His mind churned with possibilities, none of them good. What was Evelyn transferring? Money? Property? Worse? His heart ached at the thought of confrontation. For years, he'd built a life of comfort and success, trusting that Evelyn was by his side for more than wealth or status. If he was wrong, if she was hiding something, could he handle the truth? The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of wood cooling in the night. Evelyn slept soundly in the next room, but Marcus knew his peace was shattered. He had to act. He had to know. By morning, Marcus made a decision. He'd confront this head-on, but not as himself. No, he'd find answers in a way Evelyn wouldn't see coming. He'd become someone else, a man invisible to her world, yet close enough to uncover her secrets. He was a man with nothing but questions, and soon he'd have answers. The sun was just beginning to rise over Phoenix, casting a warm orange hue across the sprawling city. Marcus stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the plain navy blue cap he'd picked up at a discount store the night before. His reflection stared back at him, less the polished entrepreneur and more the anonymous man he needed to become. He ran a hand over his clean-shaven face, the faint shadow of exhaustion lingering beneath his eyes. This wasn't the kind of job he had ever imagined himself doing, but it wasn't a choice anymore. It was a necessity. Evelyn's secrets demanded answers, and this was the only way to get close enough to find them. He'd heard about the car wash on the edge of town, a small, busy business known for catering to high-end clients. It was the perfect cover. As Marcus pulled into the lot, the sounds of jets spraying water and brushes scrubbing cars filled the air. The place smelled of soap and wet pavement. His luxury car was parked miles away. He had arrived in a beat-up sedan he'd borrowed from an old friend. Blending in was the key. "Can I help you?" A gruff voice interrupted his thoughts. Marcus turned to see a man in his 50s with weathered skin and piercing brown eyes. Javier Cruz. The name was stitched onto the man's shirt, just below a faded logo of the car wash. "Yes, I'm here about the job," Marcus said, trying to sound confident. Javier crossed his arms, scrutinizing him. "You don't look like you've done a day of manual labor in your life." Marcus swallowed, the sting of the comment sharper than he expected. "I'm willing to learn." "Learning's not enough in this business," Javier shot back. "You keep up or you're out. We don't have time for charity cases." Marcus bit back his pride, nodding. "I understand. I'll work hard." Javier's gaze lingered for a moment before he sighed. "Fine, you start today. Don't expect me to go easy on you." The day began with a crash course in the basics: hoses, vacuums, and industrial polishers. Marcus's hands, accustomed to signing contracts and holding golf clubs, fumbled awkwardly. By midday, his shirt clung to his back with sweat, and his arms ached from scrubbing tires. "Delaney, right?" A younger man, tall and wiry, leaned against a nearby car, smirking. "What kind of name is that for someone who works here?" "Just a name," Marcus replied curtly, avoiding eye contact. "I'm Tommy," the man continued. "Javier's kid. I see everything that happens here, and let me tell you, people like you don't last long." Marcus paused, gripping the nozzle of the hose tightly. "I guess we'll see, won't we?" Tommy's smirk widened. "Yeah, we will." The tension between them simmered as the day wore on. Marcus kept his head down, observing everything. It didn't take long to notice that the car wash wasn't just a place for cleaning vehicles. It was a hub of connections. Clients lingered, chatting with employees about everything from investments to personal gossip. And then there was Evelyn. Late in the afternoon, Marcus's stomach clenched as a sleek black SUV pulled into the lot. He didn't need to see the driver to know it was her. Evelyn stepped out, her tailored dress a sharp contrast to the grease-stained uniforms around her. She handed her keys to another worker without even glancing in Marcus's direction. "Mrs. Delaney!" Tommy called out, his tone unnervingly cheerful. Evelyn smiled, shaking his hand like they were old friends. Marcus worked silently, his heart pounding in his chest as he maneuvered closer. He heard fragments of their conversation, mostly pleasantries, but it was clear they knew each other. Then, as if fate demanded it, Peter Calloway appeared. Peter's voice boomed over the noise of the car wash. "Evelyn, I was wondering if we'd run into each other." The two exchanged a hug that lingered just a second too long. Marcus tightened his grip on the bucket in his hand, forcing himself to stay still. "I'll see you at the meeting tomorrow," Peter said casually, his tone laced with familiarity. "Everything's ready to move forward." Evelyn nodded, her expression serene. "Of course, I wouldn't miss it." Marcus clenched his jaw, every instinct screaming at him to confront her, but he knew better. He needed more. He needed proof. As the SUV disappeared down the street, Marcus exhaled slowly. His mission had begun, and if today was any indication, the truth was more tangled and dangerous than he ever imagined. The rhythm of the car wash filled the air, the hiss of water jets, the hum of vacuums, the occasional clang of tools. Marcus kept his head down, scrubbing the wheel of a Mercedes that had just rolled in. His body ached from the previous day, but his mind was sharper than ever. Evelyn's visit yesterday hadn't just shaken him. It had left him desperate for answers. Today, Marcus stayed on high alert. His instincts told him she, or Peter, would show up again, and he couldn't afford to miss a moment. The car wash wasn't just a workplace. It was a revolving door for secrets, a place where conversations slipped between the sounds of machinery. As if summoned by his thoughts, Marcus spotted Peter Calloway stepping out of a luxury sports car. Peter's presence oozed confidence, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the grime of the car wash. He exchanged a few words with Javier before walking over to Tommy, who greeted him with a handshake. Their familiarity grated on Marcus's nerves. Marcus shifted his position, staying within earshot, while appearing engrossed in his task. Peter's voice carried just enough to catch snippets. "Everything's set," Peter was saying, his tone low but steady. "We just need her to finalize it." "She's been a little nervous," Tommy replied, his voice tinged with hesitation. "You sure this is all gonna work?" "It has to," Peter said, his tone clipped. "We've come too far to back out now." Marcus felt his grip tighten on the sponge in his hand. He glanced up, catching Peter's piercing gaze as if the man knew he was being watched. Marcus quickly looked away, his heart pounding. Did Peter suspect him? Moments later, a sleek black SUV pulled into the lot. Marcus's stomach churned as Evelyn stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement. She looked impeccable, her tailored blazer and sunglasses shielding her emotions. Her presence felt deliberate, planned. Marcus ducked behind the car he was cleaning, keeping himself hidden as she approached Peter. "Evelyn," Peter greeted her, his tone warm but firm. "Good to see you." She nodded, removing her sunglasses with a graceful motion. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. They moved a few steps away, just out of earshot, their expressions serious. Marcus edged closer, his heart thudding in his chest. He could see Peter's lips moving, his gesture sharp, while Evelyn's composed demeanor started to crack. Her hand fluttered to her collar, a telltale sign of her discomfort. Finally, Evelyn's voice cut through the ambient noise, sharp and clear. "I told you, I need more time. He's starting to notice things." Peter's expression hardened. "Then make sure he doesn't. You knew what you were getting into." "I didn't think it would go this far," Evelyn snapped, her voice trembling. "If he finds out, it'll ruin everything." Marcus clenched his fists, the weight of her words crushing him. Ruin everything? What was everything? His mind raced with possibilities. Was it about their marriage? His business? Both? The conversation ended abruptly as Peter placed a hand on Evelyn's shoulder, leaning in close. "You've got until Friday," he said. "No more excuses." Evelyn pulled away, her expression unreadable. Without another word, she climbed back into her SUV and drove off. Peter lingered for a moment, his gaze scanning the lot as if searching for something or someone. Marcus turned away just in time, his breath shallow as he tried to appear invisible. Minutes later, Peter left as well, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. His chest heaved as he processed what he had just witnessed. Evelyn's fear, Peter's threats, it all pointed to something bigger than he could have imagined. But what? He looked down at his hands, the grease from the day's work still clinging to his skin. His life felt as dirty and tangled as the suds circling the drain. He needed answers, but the risks were growing. One misstep, and this fragile facade he'd built would crumble. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Marcus made a silent vow. He wasn't just chasing the truth anymore. He was preparing for a battle. Whatever Evelyn and Peter were hiding, he'd uncover it, no matter the cost. The house was silent. Too silent. Marcus crept down the dimly lit hallway, his bare feet muffled against the hardwood floor. Evelyn's usual nightly routine, a cup of chamomile tea and soft jazz playing from the living room, was conspicuously absent. She had gone to bed early, citing a headache, leaving Marcus alone with the quiet and with his thoughts. He lingered outside her office, his hand hovering over the door handle. He'd never entered this space without Evelyn's invitation. It was her sanctuary, lined with meticulously organized bookshelves and her prized collection of vintage interior design sketches. Tonight it felt more like a vault, holding answers he desperately needed. The door creaked as it opened. His pulse quickened. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, a reminder of Evelyn's constant need for perfection. Marcus's gaze swept across the room, his mind racing. Where would she hide something? A drawer? The desk? His eyes locked on the antique cabinet against the far wall. He knelt, his fingers fumbling at the small brass keyhole. Locked. Of course. He let out a frustrated sigh and glanced around, searching for anything that might open it. Then he remembered the key Evelyn always wore around her neck, a delicate gold chain she never took off. He'd once joked about it being her lucky charm. Quietly, he padded back toward the bedroom. Evelyn lay soundly asleep, her breath soft and even. The chain glinted faintly in the moonlight streaming through the window. His hand shook as he reached for it, heart hammering against his ribs. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the chain from her neck, freezing every time she stirred. When he finally had it, he exhaled silently, retreating back to her office like a thief. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The cabinet door swung open, revealing neatly stacked files, envelopes, and, at the bottom, a small safe. Marcus's breath hitched. A safe? His mind buzzed with possibilities. He crouched lower, inspecting the keypad. 4 digits. His first instinct was their anniversary. It failed. Then Evelyn's birthday. Also wrong. Frustration bubbled inside him as he stared at the blinking red light. Think, Marcus. Think. Then it hit him. Peter Calloway. Could she have used something tied to him? He hesitated, bile rising in his throat at the thought. 4 digits. The year Peter's firm was founded. He typed it in. 2009. A soft click. The safe opened. Inside, he found exactly what he'd feared. Evidence. Fake passports, all with Evelyn's face but different names. Rachel Whitmore stood out. Was it a coincidence? Or could it be tied to Sarah at the car wash? His fingers trembled as he sifted through more documents. Offshore account statements, a ledger filled with cryptic entries labeled Phase 2, and a set of deeds. One name appeared consistently alongside Evelyn's. Peter Calloway. Marcus's stomach churned. The offshore accounts alone pointed to something massive. Money laundering, fraud, maybe worse. And those deeds? They weren't for properties under her business. They were assets tied to his company. A hollow ache settled in his chest. How deep did this betrayal run? He stared at the documents, memories of their life together flashing through his mind. Evelyn laughing at their wedding reception. Evelyn comforting him during a rough quarter at work. Evelyn promising to always be by his side. Had it all been a lie? His thoughts were interrupted by a noise from the hallway. His head snapped up. Footsteps. He scrambled to shut the safe, sliding everything back into place. His heart thundered as the door handle to the office turned. Evelyn's silhouette appeared in the doorway, her voice groggy. "Marcus, what are you doing in here?" For a moment, his mind blanked. The chain. He'd left the chain on the desk. Thinking quickly, he turned, his face calm despite the storm raging inside. "Couldn't sleep," he said, gesturing toward the bookshelf. "Thought I'd grab something to read." Her eyes narrowed, drifting to the desk. The tension was palpable. She moved closer, picking up the chain and holding it out. "You were looking for this?" He forced a smile, taking the chain from her hand. "Yeah, just realized I borrowed it earlier. Didn't want it to get lost." Evelyn studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "You should get some rest." As she left, Marcus sat in the darkened room, his hands still trembling. He couldn't rest, not now. The pieces were starting to fit together, and the picture they painted wasn't just betrayal. It was devastation. The morning sun filtered through the thin clouds, casting a muted glow over the car wash. Marcus adjusted his cap, wiping his hands on a rag as he prepared for another grueling day. His mind was heavy, replaying the discovery from the safe the night before. Evelyn's betrayal was a storm brewing in the background, but today, the storm took a different form. "Hey, Marcus," Sarah called out, her voice strained yet cheerful. She was balancing a tray of cleaning supplies in one hand while pulling a vacuum hose with the other. Her red hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and despite the exhaustion etched on her face, she managed to smile. "Morning," Marcus replied, his tone cautious. Sarah was one of the few people at the car wash who didn't pry into his life. In return, he avoided hers. Until today. The day wore on, the mundane tasks offering Marcus little distraction from his thoughts. He noticed Sarah working slower than usual, her movements sluggish. She winced as she bent to pick up a dropped cloth, her hand clutching her side. "Sarah, are you okay?" Marcus asked, stepping closer. "Fine," she said quickly, brushing him off. But the look in her eyes said otherwise. During their lunch break, Marcus found her sitting on an overturned bucket, her head in her hands. He hesitated for a moment before approaching. "You don't look fine," Sarah sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Just tired, that's all." Marcus sat beside her, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he spoke. "Tired doesn't make you wince every time you move. What's going on?" Her defenses crumbled. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "It's my son, Liam." Marcus leaned forward, his attention fully on her now. "What about him?" "He's sick," she said, her voice trembling. "Real sick. He has a heart condition, needs surgery. But the insurance barely covers anything, and the bills are piling up faster than I can handle." She let out a shaky breath, trying to keep her composure. "I'm working double shifts, doing everything I can, but it's not enough." Marcus's chest tightened. Her words struck a chord, stirring a memory of his own childhood, his father struggling to make ends meet after his mother's passing. He saw a flicker of himself in Sarah's desperation. "Have you asked for help?" he asked gently. She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "From who? People like us don't get help, Marcus. We survive, or we don't." The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. For all his wealth and privilege, he had never faced a struggle like hers. He felt a pang of guilt. He could leave the car wash anytime, walk away from this life. Sarah couldn't. She was trapped, fighting a battle she couldn't afford to lose. Marcus reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded $50 bill. "Take this, it's not much, but no." Sarah's voice was firm, her eyes flashing with pride. "I don't take handouts." "It's not a handout," Marcus said, his tone steady. "It's just a little help. You don't have to do this alone." For a moment she stared at the bill, her fingers twitching as if debating whether to take it. Finally she shook her head. "Thank you, but no. Liam needs me to be strong, and that means standing on my own 2 feet." Marcus nodded, slipping the bill back into his pocket. He admired her resolve, even if it broke his heart to see her struggle. "If you ever change your mind, the offer stands." Sarah smiled faintly, wiping her eyes. "Thanks, Marcus. You're a good guy, you know that?" He didn't respond, the lump in his throat making it impossible. He wasn't sure if he deserved those words, but he knew one thing. Sarah's fight was a reminder of why he was here. He couldn't let Evelyn and Peter get away with their schemes, not when people like Sarah and Liam were barely hanging on. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, Marcus returned to his tasks with renewed determination. Sarah's story was a crack in his carefully constructed wall of detachment, but it was also a spark, a reminder of what truly mattered. Marcus sat at the kitchen counter, the soft glow of his laptop illuminating the darkness around him. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, but inside his head, a storm was raging. Evelyn's secrets loomed larger than ever, each discovery drawing him further into a labyrinth of lies. Tonight, he wasn't Marcus Delaney, millionaire entrepreneur. He was a man searching for answers, no matter the cost. He opened his company's financial database, the familiar interface a cold reminder of the empire he had built from scratch. The numbers should have reassured him, but instead, they mocked him. Calm, precise rows of figures hiding the chaos beneath. He navigated to the shared accounts, his fingers trembling as he typed in the access codes. The first discrepancies appeared almost immediately. Transfers, large, frequent, and untraceable, had been moving out of the company's operational fund into an offshore account. The recipient? A name he recognized too well. Peter Calloway. Marcus's chest tightened as he scrolled through months of transactions. The amounts varied, but the pattern was unmistakable. Evelyn wasn't just complicit, she was orchestrating something massive. His hands clenched into fists as he realized the implications. They were siphoning money, piece by piece, draining his company under the guise of legitimate expenses. He opened the ledger he'd copied from Evelyn's safe, cross-referencing it with the database. Each entry aligned perfectly. Phase 2, Q2, Project Slate, Capital Reserve. The terms were vague, but the intent was clear. This wasn't just fraud, it was dismantling his life's work. The rage boiled over, but just as quickly it was replaced by something heavier. Despair. This was his wife, the woman he had trusted with his heart, his future. He thought of their wedding day, her promises of partnership and loyalty. Where had it all gone wrong? A soft creak jolted him from his thoughts. He turned to see Evelyn standing in the doorway, her silhouette barely visible in the faint light. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and she clutched her robe tightly around her. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice gentle but guarded. Marcus forced a smile. closing the laptop with a deliberate slowness. Just catching up on some work. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing slightly as they flicked to the closed laptop. At this hour? Deadlines, he replied smoothly. You know how it is. Evelyn studied him for a moment longer, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. Don't overwork yourself, she said softly. We've both been stretched thin lately. Her words were like needles under his skin. She was stretched thin? Doing what? Stealing from him? Betraying him? But Marcus held his tongue, knowing that a confrontation now would get him nowhere. She lingered for a moment longer before disappearing back into the shadows of the hallway. When she was gone, Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of his discoveries pressing down on him. He reopened the laptop, his resolve hardening. It wasn't just about the money. It was about everything they had built together, everything she was tearing apart. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the car wash earlier than usual, his mind still reeling. The monotony of scrubbing tires and vacuuming seats offered little solace, but he kept his head down, determined to maintain his cover. Hey, Delaney, Tommy's voice broke through the din. The younger man approached, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. You look like you've seen a ghost. Marcus forced a chuckle. Rough night. What's up? Tommy leaned against a nearby car, his gaze sharp. You know, I've been thinking, you don't really fit in here. It's like you're hiding something. The accusation was casual, but it sent a ripple of unease through Marcus. He straightened, meeting Tommy's gaze. Everyone's hiding something, he said evenly. Don't you think? Tommy's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. Yeah, maybe. He pushed off the car and started walking away, tossing a final remark over his shoulder. Just remember, secrets don't stay buried for long. The words lingered with Marcus as he returned to his work. Secrets, lies, betrayal. They were all around him, closing in like a noose. He thought of Sarah, her quiet resilience in the face of impossible odds. Her struggle was real, tangible. His was a web of deceit, spun by the person he had once trusted most in the world. By the end of the day, Marcus's determination had crystallized into a single, unshakable thought. He couldn't let Evelyn and Peter win. Whatever they were planning, he would stop it. Even if it meant unraveling everything he thought he knew about his life. Dinner was an unusually quiet affair. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his fork idly pushing food around his plate. Evelyn was across from him, her gaze flickering between him and her untouched wine glass. The silence between them had grown heavier in recent days, a quiet battlefield neither was ready to step onto. So, Marcus began, his voice cutting through the tension. How was your day? Evelyn glanced up, her smile tight. Busy, as always. Meetings, clients, you know how it is. Meetings must have gone late, he replied, his tone casual but probing. I didn't hear you come in until after midnight. Her hand froze mid-reach for the glass, but only for a second. She recovered quickly, taking a measured sip. One of my clients is expanding their property. We had to finalize the designs. She set the glass down, her eyes meeting his. Is there a reason you're keeping tabs on me, Marcus? It was a bold move, turning the table so quickly. But Marcus was ready. He smiled, leaning back in his chair. Not at all. Just curious. You've been working so hard lately. I worry about you. Evelyn's jaw tightened, her fingers gripping the stem of her glass. I'm fine. You don't need to worry. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. But before Marcus could press further, Evelyn stood abruptly, gathering her plate. I'm going to get some rest. It's been a long day. She walked briskly to the kitchen, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. He stared at her empty seat, his mind replaying her words. The cracks in her composure were growing wider, and he needed to know what she was hiding before it all came crashing down. Later that evening, Marcus found himself sitting in his study, staring at the computer screen. He couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn's late nights weren't just about work. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of muffled voices coming from the hallway. He moved quietly, following the sound to Evelyn's office. The door was ajar and he could see her pacing, phone pressed to her ear. No, I told you, we're not ready yet, she hissed, her tone sharper than he'd ever heard it. Marcus is starting to ask questions. I can't keep lying to him forever. Marcus's stomach twisted. She was talking about him. Evelyn stopped pacing, her back to the door. No, I'll handle it. Just give me time. She ended the call and stood there for a moment, her shoulders slumping. Marcus took a step back, retreating into the shadows before she could see him. His mind was racing, the pieces of the puzzle coming together in ways he didn't want to believe. The next morning, Evelyn's facade was back in place. She moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, her tone light and cheerful as she spoke to Marcus. But he could see the strain in her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands when she reached for her coffee cup. "Big plans today?" she asked, her voice casual. Marcus shook his head, forcing a smile. "Just the usual. You?" "Same," she replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. As she left, Marcus felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Anger? Sadness? Betrayal? He didn't know. All he knew was that Evelyn was slipping further away from him, and he wasn't sure if he could bring her back. Later at the car wash, Marcus found himself distracted, his mind replaying Evelyn's phone call. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice Tommy approaching until the younger man spoke. "You good, Delaney?" Tommy asked, his tone unusually concerned. Marcus blinked, nodding quickly. "Yeah, just tired." Tommy studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Whatever you say." As the day wore on, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Evelyn's desperation was growing, and with it, the risk of everything spiraling out of control. He needed answers, and he needed them soon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the car wash as Marcus struggled with the stubborn bolts on a malfunctioning hose. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, his frustration mounting. It wasn't the work that bothered him. It was the growing tension with Tommy Cruz. Tommy had been hovering all day, watching Marcus with an intensity that was hard to ignore. It wasn't just suspicion. It was something deeper. Marcus could feel it in the younger man's taunts, in the way Tommy's eyes narrowed every time he caught Marcus observing something too closely. "Hey, Delaney," Tommy called out, leaning casually against a pole. "Need some help? Or are you still figuring out which end of the wrench to use?" Marcus forced a smile, keeping his focus on the task at hand. "I've got it, thanks." Tommy's smirk widened. "Sure you do." As the day wore on, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Tools he had just set down seemed to disappear, only to reappear in odd places. His bucket of cleaning solution had been mysteriously spilled when he turned his back. By the time the afternoon shift ended, his patience was worn thin. When Marcus returned to the employee locker room, the sense of unease deepened. His locker door was slightly ajar. He opened it cautiously, finding a neatly folded note resting on top of his belongings. The words scrawled in bold, jagged letters sent a chill down his spine. "Stay out of Cruz family business or you'll regret it." He clenched the note, his mind racing. It wasn't hard to guess who had left it, but the intent behind the message was clear. Tommy knew, or at least suspected, that Marcus wasn't who he claimed to be. Marcus's opportunity to confront Tommy came sooner than he expected. As he stepped outside, he spotted Tommy lingering near the edge of the lot, lighting a cigarette. Marcus approached him, keeping his steps measured. "We need to talk," Marcus said, his tone firm but calm. Tommy blew out a cloud of smoke, his expression unreadable. "Do we?" "Yes," Marcus replied, holding up the note. "What's this about?" Tommy's eyes flicked to the paper, and for a moment his smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly, shrugging. "Maybe it's a warning. Maybe it's advice. Depends on how you look at it." "Look, I don't know what you think I'm doing here, but I'm just trying to make a living," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tension building inside him. "If you've got a problem, say it." Tommy stepped closer, the cigarette dangling from his lips. "Here's the thing, Delaney. You don't belong here. You don't talk like us, don't act like us. You're hiding something, and I don't like it." Marcus's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Tommy shot back. "And if you're messing with my dad or this place, I'll make sure you regret it." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threats. Marcus held Tommy's gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm not here to mess with anyone, but if you've got something to say, say it now." Tommy took a drag from his cigarette, his eyes narrowing. Just watch yourself, Delaney. Secrets have a way of coming out. With that, he flicked the cigarette to the ground and walked away, leaving Marcus alone in the fading light. The encounter left Marcus shaken but resolute. Tommy's aggression wasn't just about suspicion. It was about protecting something. But what? As Marcus gathered his things and prepared to leave, his mind buzzed with questions. Did Tommy know about Evelyn's connection to Peter? Was he involved in the larger scheme? Or was he protecting his family from something entirely different? One thing was clear. Tommy wasn't just a nuisance. He was a threat, and Marcus needed to tread carefully if he wanted to uncover the truth without blowing his cover. The rain pattered softly against the windows of the living room, casting ripples of shadow across the polished hardwood floor. Marcus sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly together as he stared at Evelyn, who stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed defensively. The tension between them was palpable, an invisible wall built brick by brick over the last few weeks. "Why don't you just ask me what you want to know, Marcus?" Evelyn's voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her unease. She clutched the edge of her shawl like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Marcus leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "All right, I will." His voice was quiet, almost calm, but it carried an edge sharp enough to cut through the air. "Who is Peter Calloway to you?" Evelyn flinched, the name hitting her like a physical blow. Her gaze darted to the window as if searching for an escape. "He's a client," she said finally, her tone carefully measured. "Don't lie to me," Marcus shot back, his voice rising slightly. He stood, closing the space between them. "I've seen the transfers, Evelyn. I've seen the documents. You're not just working with him, you're tied to him." Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment Marcus saw something break in her, a crack in the armor she had so carefully constructed. "It's complicated," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then simplify it for me." Marcus's frustration boiled over. "You owe me that much." Evelyn sank into the armchair, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her temples. "You don't understand," she began, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't want to do this. I was forced into it." "By who, Peter?" Marcus demanded, pacing the room like a caged animal. "What does he have over you?" Evelyn hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's not just him," she said finally. "It's everything. The business, the debt. He knew about it, Marcus. He knew how much we were struggling, and he offered a way out." Marcus stopped in his tracks, staring at her in disbelief. "A way out? By stealing from me? From my company?" Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I didn't know it would get this far. At first it was just small amounts, consulting fees, extra invoices. But then Peter started demanding more. He said if I didn't cooperate, he'd destroy us." "Destroy us how?" Marcus pressed, his voice softening slightly. "What leverage does he have?" Evelyn shook her head, her expression one of defeat. "I don't know all the details. He hinted at something, at people he knows, connections that could ruin you, ruin us. I was scared, Marcus. I didn't know what else to do." Marcus's heart twisted as he watched her crumble. He wanted to believe her, to believe that fear had driven her actions rather than greed or malice. But the evidence pointed to more than just desperation. There were too many pieces that didn't fit, too many questions left unanswered. "I'm trying to protect you," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "Everything I've done, it's been to keep us safe." Marcus let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Safe? You think this is safety? Lying to me, stealing from me, partnering with someone like Peter Calloway? That's not protection, Evelyn, that's betrayal." Her tears finally spilled over and she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't know what else to do," she repeated, her voice muffled. "You were so busy with the company, with everything else. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He took a step back, the anger in his chest giving way to something deeper, something more painful. "You should have come to me," he said quietly. "We could have faced this together." Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "It's too late for that now." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus turned away, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He didn't know what to believe anymore, whether Evelyn was the victim or the perpetrator, whether she was telling the truth or spinning another web of lies. But one thing was clear. Whatever was coming, they were far from safe. The email arrived at 2:37 a.m. Marcus sat in the darkness of his study, bathed in the cold glow of his laptop. His eyes burned from hours of staring at financial documents, cross-referencing ledgers and chasing shadows. He was exhausted but wired, his mind refusing to rest. The sound of the notification pierced the silence, making him jump. He clicked on the message. The subject line read, "You're in deeper than you think." The sender's address was an indecipherable jumble of letters and numbers, but the tone of the email was chillingly direct. "Marcus, stop digging. You don't know what you're dealing with. Peter Calloway isn't the man you think he is. If you keep pushing, you'll regret it. This isn't just about your company. It's about your life. Walk away while you still can. Consider this your only warning." Marcus stared at the screen, the words blurring as his heart pounded. He reread the message, each line sinking deeper into his chest. The email wasn't just a threat, it was a trap, a calculated move to unnerve him, and it worked. Who was behind it? Was it Peter? Someone working with him? Or Evelyn? The thought twisted in his gut. He shut the laptop, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his temples. Every lead he followed seemed to uncover more questions than answers. The following morning, Marcus arrived at the car wash early, his mind still churning over the email. The rhythmic sounds of hoses and vacuums were almost soothing, a strange contrast to the chaos inside his head. He kept his head low, focusing on the task at hand, but his thoughts kept returning to the message. "Rough night?" Javier's voice broke through his haze. The older man stood a few feet away, his eyes sharp but concerned. Marcus nodded, managing a tight smile. "Something like that. You've got that look," Javier said, crossing his arms. "The look of a man who's carrying too much and hasn't figured out how to put it down." Marcus hesitated, the weight of the email pressing heavily on him. What if you found out something about someone you trusted, something that could destroy everything?" Javier raised an eyebrow, his expression thoughtful. "Trust is fragile, Delaney. Once it's broken, it's hard to fix. But sometimes it's worth trying." Marcus wanted to believe him, but the email made it clear. There was no room for trust anymore. As the day dragged on, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Tommy's usual taunts were absent, replaced by a lingering silence that felt heavier than words. Even Sarah, typically chatty during breaks, seemed preoccupied. By the afternoon, Marcus had made up his mind. He had to confront Evelyn. The email had pushed him to the edge, and he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence any longer. He left the car wash early, driving home with a mix of anger and dread coursing through his veins. When he arrived, Evelyn was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up as he entered, her smile faltering at the intensity in his eyes. "Marcus, is everything okay?" "No," he said, his voice clipped. "We need to talk." Evelyn set down the knife, her hand stilling. "What's going on?" He pulled out his phone, opening the email and placing it on the counter in front of her. "Explain this." She picked up the phone, her expression shifting from confusion to fear as she read the message. "Where did you get this?" "It doesn't matter," Marcus snapped. "What matters is who sent it. Do you know? Is it Peter? Is it you?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, shaking her head. "I swear, Marcus, I didn't send this. I don't know who did." "Then tell me what's going on," he shouted, his frustration boiling over. "Tell me the truth, Evelyn, because I'm running out of reasons to believe you." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment she looked utterly defeated. "I don't know who sent it," she said quietly. "But whoever it is, they're right. You're in danger, Marcus. We both are." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications Marcus wasn't ready to face. His anger ebbed, replaced by a cold dread. If Evelyn was telling the truth, then the threat wasn't just real. It was closer than he had imagined. The grand hall shimmered with opulence, chandeliers casting golden light over the elegantly dressed guests milling about. The hum of polite conversation and clinking glasses filled the air as Marcus stepped into the room, his jaw set with determination. His black tuxedo was perfectly tailored, blending seamlessly with the crowd. but inside his nerves were taut, a string pulled to its breaking point. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Evelyn was somewhere in the room, likely attached to Peter Calloway's side. Tonight, Marcus wasn't here to blend in. He was here to expose the truth. "Marcus!" a voice called out, and he turned to see an old business acquaintance, his hand already extended for a shake. Marcus obliged, exchanging the bare minimum of pleasantries before scanning the room again. Then he saw her. Evelyn stood near the far end of the room, her emerald gown catching the light as she laughed at something Peter said. She looked radiant, her smile wide and confident. But Marcus knew better now. It was a mask, and he was determined to shatter it. His path to her was blocked by waiters and mingling guests, each step feeling heavier as he approached. By the time he reached her, Peter had noticed his presence. The man's smile tightened, his eyes narrowing as he took in Marcus's expression. "Marcus," Peter greeted him warmly, extending his hand. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Marcus ignored the hand, his eyes locked on Evelyn. "Can we talk privately?" Evelyn's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Marcus, what's going on?" "Now," Marcus said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Peter chuckled, stepping between them. "Come on, Marcus. This is a gala, not a boardroom. Let's keep it civil." "I'm done being civil," Marcus snapped, his voice cutting through the hum of the room. Several heads turned, the conversations around them faltering. Evelyn's cheeks flushed as she glanced nervously at the growing audience. "Marcus, you're making a scene," she hissed, stepping closer. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done weeks ago," he said, his voice steady despite the anger coursing through him. "I know about the transfers, Evelyn. I know about Peter, and I know exactly what you've been doing behind my back." The room went deathly quiet. Evelyn's lips parted in shock, her carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of his words. Peter, ever the opportunist, tried to intervene. "Marcus, I think you're misunderstanding something," Peter began, his tone oily. "This isn't the time or place for—" "Don't," Marcus interrupted, turning his glare on Peter. "Don't you dare pretend to be innocent in all this. I've seen the accounts, the documents. You've been using Evelyn to funnel money out of my company, haven't you?" Peter's mask slipped for a fraction of a second, a flicker of irritation crossing his face before he recovered. "These are serious accusations, Marcus. I suggest you think carefully about what you're saying." "I've thought about it plenty," Marcus said coldly, "and I've got the proof to back it up." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Marcus, please, let's not do this here." "Why not?" Marcus shot back, his voice rising. "Are you afraid of the truth? Or are you afraid of what everyone else will think when they see who you really are?" Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The silence stretched on, the tension in the room almost unbearable. Finally, Peter sighed, his tone turning icy. "You're out of your depth, Marcus. I suggest you walk away before you make things worse for yourself." "Is that a threat?" Marcus asked, stepping closer. "Because I'm not afraid of you, Peter." Peter smirked, his confidence returning. "You should be." Evelyn's hand shot out, gripping Marcus's arm. "Stop," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please." Marcus stared at her, searching her face for any sign of the woman he thought he knew. But all he saw was fear. Fear of Peter, fear of the truth, and perhaps even fear of herself. Without another word, Marcus turned and walked away, his chest heaving with a mix of anger and heartbreak. The confrontation had left him with more questions than answers, but one thing was certain. The battle was far from over. The car wash was quieter than usual that morning, a strange stillness settling over the place. Marcus worked mechanically, his mind replaying the chaos of the gala. Evelyn's tearful pleas, Peter's smug threats, they were all etched into his memory like scars. He needed clarity, but every step seemed to lead him further into the shadows. "Delaney," a voice broke through his haze. Sarah stood a few feet away, her hands clutching a worn envelope. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously. "We need to talk." Marcus straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's going on?" Sarah glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. "Not here. Meet me in the break room in 5 minutes." Her urgency sent a jolt through Marcus. He nodded, watching as she hurried away. When the allotted time passed, he made his way to the small, cluttered break room at the back of the lot. Sarah was waiting for him, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "What's this about?" Marcus asked, closing the door behind him. Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slid the envelope across the table. "You need to see this." Marcus picked it up, his brow furrowing as he opened it. Inside were copies of documents, bank statements, contracts, and emails. Each one bore Peter Calloway's name, tying him directly to a web of fraudulent accounts and illegal transactions. "Where did you get this?" Marcus's voice was low, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. Sarah hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Tommy left it in the back office. I don't think he meant for me to find it, but I did." Marcus's chest tightened. "Sarah, this is dangerous. If Tommy or Peter find out you have this, I don't care," she interrupted, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "You're the only one who can stop this, Marcus. You have the resources, the connections. If you don't do something, they'll keep getting away with it." Her words hit him like a freight train. She was right. He had spent weeks uncovering fragments of the truth, but this was the smoking gun. Still, the risk was enormous, not just for him, but for Sarah and her son. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked, his voice softening. "You don't owe me anything." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because I know what it's like to feel powerless, to watch people like Peter take everything and think they can get away with it. And because," her voice cracked, "because I can't let my son grow up in a world where people like that win." A lump formed in Marcus's throat. He saw the resolve in her eyes, the quiet strength that had kept her standing despite everything she'd been through. She was risking everything, her job, her safety, her future, to help him. "I won't let anything happen to you," Marcus said, his tone resolute, "or to Liam. I promise." Sarah nodded, a faint smile breaking through her fear. "Just be careful, Marcus. They're not going to go down without a fight." As the weight of the documents settled in his hands, Marcus knew she was right. This was more than just a battle for his company or his marriage. It was a fight for justice, for redemption, for the chance to set things right. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his study. The envelope spread out before him. Each piece of paper told a story of greed, betrayal, and manipulation. But they also told another story, one of resilience and courage, of people like Sarah who refused to back down in the face of overwhelming odds. The road ahead was treacherous, but for the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a spark of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight, and with allies like Sarah, he knew he stood a chance. The hum of the city was muffled by the tinted windows of Peter Calloway's car. He sat in the back seat, his fingers drumming against his knee, his jaw clenched tightly. The driver glanced at him nervously in the rearview mirror but said nothing. Peter didn't notice. His mind was too consumed by the growing cracks in his meticulously crafted scheme. "Stop here," Peter barked. The car rolled to a halt outside an unmarked office building. Peter stepped out, his shoes clicking sharply against the pavement as he entered. Inside, the air was thick with the faint smell of cigar smoke and leather, a quiet hum of voices echoing in the halls. He pushed open a heavy wooden door to reveal a sleek office where a man in his late 50s sat behind a desk. The man looked up, raising an eyebrow at Peter's abrupt entrance. "We have a problem," Peter said without preamble. The man leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "We always do." "What's this one?" "Delaney," Peter hissed, pacing the room. "He's digging too deep, and worse, he's got help. Someone at that damn car wash handed him documents, proof." The man's expression darkened. "How much proof?" "Enough to tie me, and by extension you, to everything," Peter replied. "If he goes public, we're finished." The man leaned forward, his voice low. "Then you stop him, by any means necessary." Peter nodded, his mind racing. He left the office, pulling his phone from his pocket as he strode down the hall. He dialed a number, his voice sharp when the call connected. "It's time to send a message." Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his study, the stolen documents spread out in front of him like puzzle pieces. Every page painted a damning picture of Peter's network, shell companies, fraudulent accounts, offshore holdings. Marcus had compiled it all, but the weight of what to do next loomed over him. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. He tensed, his eyes darting to the clock. It was nearly midnight. He grabbed the documents and stuffed them into a drawer before heading cautiously to the door. When he opened it, he found Sarah standing there, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Sarah, what's wrong?" Marcus asked, stepping aside to let her in. "They know," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Tommy found out I took the documents. He cornered me in the parking lot, said I'd made a huge mistake." Marcus's stomach sank. "Did he hurt you?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, but he said Peter knows everything. Marcus, he's coming after you." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of shattering glass echoed from the back of the house. He turned, his heart pounding as he rushed toward the noise. In the kitchen, a brick lay amid the shards of a broken window. Attached to it was a note. "This is your last warning. Drop it, or next time we won't miss." Marcus picked up the note, his hands trembling. The words were crude, hastily scrawled, but the message was unmistakable. He turned to Sarah, who stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale. "You need to go," Marcus said firmly. "Take Liam and get somewhere safe. Tonight." "But what about you?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I'll handle this," Marcus replied, his tone steady despite the fear coursing through him. "But I need to know you're safe." Sarah nodded reluctantly, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed her coat and left, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Marcus stood alone in the kitchen, the note still clutched in his hand. The warning was clear. Peter was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. But Marcus wasn't backing down. He had come too far to turn back now. As the night stretched on, Marcus began preparing for the next move. The battle lines were drawn, and he knew one thing with certainty. Peter Calloway wasn't going down without a fight. The rain poured relentlessly against the windows, the sound filling the otherwise silent room. Evelyn sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked smaller than usual, her usual poise and confidence replaced by an air of defeat. Marcus stood across from her, his arms crossed, his expression hard. "We can't keep dancing around this," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "I need the truth, Evelyn, all of it." Evelyn lifted her gaze to meet his, her eyes red from tears she hadn't yet shed. "You think you already know everything, don't you?" she whispered. "You've pieced together enough to hate me." "I don't want to hate you," Marcus replied, his voice softening slightly. "But I need to understand why. Why you did this. Why you betrayed me." Evelyn let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she ran them through her hair. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she began, her voice barely audible. "When Peter approached me, I thought it was just a business opportunity, a way to bring in extra income, to help us." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. He let her continue, his silence urging her on. "At first it was harmless," Evelyn said, her voice gaining strength. "Peter offered me a consulting role for his development projects. He paid well, and I didn't see the harm in it. But then the demands started to grow. He wanted me to shift funds to optimize accounts. He said it was normal in business, just a way to keep things moving." "And you believed him?" Marcus's voice was sharp, his anger bubbling beneath the surface. Evelyn flinched but nodded. "At first, yes. But then I started to see what he was really doing. He wasn't just shifting funds, he was siphoning money from your company. When I tried to back out, he threatened me." "What kind of threats?" Marcus asked, his eyes narrowing. Evelyn's voice broke as she continued. "He said he'd destroy you, that he'd plant evidence to make it look like you were the one embezzling. He had people, connections I couldn't fight against. I was terrified, Marcus. I didn't know what to do." "So you went along with it," Marcus said bitterly. "You let him use you, use us." Evelyn buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "I didn't have a choice. He told me if I didn't cooperate, he'd ruin everything we've built. And I was scared you wouldn't believe me, that you'd think I was in on it." Marcus stared at her, his mind racing. He wanted to believe her, wanted to see the fear and regret in her eyes as proof of her sincerity. But the betrayal cut too deep, and the wounds were too fresh. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why wait until now?" Evelyn looked up at him, her tears finally spilling over. "Because I was ashamed. she admitted. I let it go too far, and I didn't know how to fix it. I thought I could protect you by keeping it quiet. But I was wrong. I see that now. Marcus turned away, his hands running through his hair as he tried to process her words. The weight of everything she had said hung heavy in the air, suffocating them both. I'm sorry, Marcus, Evelyn said, her voice trembling. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know. I never stopped loving you. Everything I did, it was to keep us safe. Marcus turned back to her, his expression unreadable. Love doesn't look like this, Evelyn. It doesn't feel like this. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands as Marcus stood frozen, unsure of what to do. A part of him wanted to comfort her, to tell her they could get through this together. But another part, the part that still felt the sting of betrayal, kept him rooted in place. As the rain continued to fall outside, the chasm between them grew wider. The truth was out, but the damage had already been done. The courtroom buzzed with muted whispers, the air electric with tension. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, his jaw set and his eyes focused ahead. Across from him, Peter Calloway lounged in his chair, his confident smirk unchanged despite the mounting evidence stacked against him. This was it, the final confrontation. The week leading up to this day had been a whirlwind. Armed with the documents Sarah had risked everything to provide, Marcus had worked tirelessly with law enforcement and a team of forensic accountants. Every detail had been scrutinized, every lead followed, and now they had the undeniable proof they needed. As the judge entered the room, silence fell like a heavy curtain. Marcus's lawyer stood, addressing the court with precision and poise. Your Honor, the evidence we've presented today demonstrates a clear and deliberate pattern of financial fraud orchestrated by Mr. Calloway. We have traced funds from Delaney Enterprises to offshore accounts managed by shell corporations tied directly to the defendant. Peter's lawyer rose to object, but the judge waved him off, allowing the prosecutor to continue. The courtroom projector flickered to life, displaying a web of transactions, names, and accounts. Each line connected to Peter like a spider ensnaring its prey. As the prosecution laid out their case, Marcus's mind drifted to the moments that had brought him here. Evelyn's confession, the late-night threats, Sarah's bravery. It all came rushing back. He tightened his fists, reminding himself that this fight wasn't just for him. It was for everyone Peter had manipulated and destroyed along the way. Mr. Delaney, the lawyer said, drawing Marcus out of his thoughts. Can you confirm for the court how these transactions came to your attention? Marcus stood, his voice steady despite the weight of the room. I uncovered irregularities in my company's accounts and followed them back to Mr. Calloway. When I confronted my team, it became clear that the fraud extended beyond what I initially suspected. It was only through the courage of an employee, someone willing to risk everything, that we obtained the evidence needed to expose his crimes. His words hung in the air, heavy with conviction. He returned to his seat, ignoring Peter's cold glare from across the room. The defense mounted their case, but it was weak, riddled with contradictions and desperate attempts to discredit the evidence. Peter's smirk began to falter as the walls closed in. Marcus watched him carefully, noting the subtle cracks in his composure. Then came the moment they had all been waiting for. The prosecution played an audio recording, a conversation between Peter and an accomplice that left no room for doubt. Peter's voice was clear, detailing the steps he had taken to siphon funds and cover his tracks. The courtroom erupted in gasps as the truth was laid bare. Peter shot to his feet, his lawyer pulling at his sleeve. "This is outrageous!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "You can't prove anything!" The judge's gavel slammed down, silencing him. "Sit down, Mr. Calloway, you'll have your turn." But it was over. The evidence was irrefutable, and Peter knew it. He sank back into his chair, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The arrogance that had carried him this far evaporated, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who had finally been caught. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in applause. Marcus sat quietly, his chest rising and falling as he processed the weight of the moment. Justice had been served, but the cost had been high. As the bailiffs escorted Peter out, Marcus caught Evelyn's eye from the gallery. She looked small, her once bright confidence dimmed by guilt and regret. But she nodded slightly, an unspoken acknowledgement of what they had both lost and what they had fought to protect. Outside the courthouse, Marcus stood in the cool afternoon air, the noise of reporters and onlookers fading into the background. He took a deep breath, letting the tension of the past months begin to unwind. The battle was over, but the scars would remain. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The truth was out, and Peter Calloway's reign of deceit was finally at an end. The morning light spilled through the large windows of Marcus's study, illuminating the space that had once been his refuge and later his war room. Now it felt different, lighter, freer, as though the weight of the past months had finally begun to lift. He sat at the desk, flipping through a binder of his company's accounts. The numbers were steady, no longer bleeding into the void that Peter Calloway had created. A soft knock at the door drew his attention. Sarah stepped in, her face bright, despite the faint exhaustion that still clung to her features. She held a steaming mug in her hands, setting it on the desk in front of Marcus. "Thought you could use this," she said with a smile. "Thanks," Marcus replied, his own smile small but genuine. "How's Liam?" Sarah's face lit up. "He's doing better. The surgery went well and the doctors are optimistic. I couldn't have done it without your help." Marcus shook his head. "You did all the hard work, Sarah. You're stronger than you think." She hesitated, then reached into her bag, pulling out an envelope. "I almost forgot. This came for you." Marcus opened it, pulling out a letter. It was from Evelyn. He unfolded the crisp paper, her handwriting neat but with slight tremors in the strokes. He began reading, his heart tightening with every word. "Marcus, I know this letter may not fix the damage I've done, but I needed to write it anyway. Thank you for giving me the chance to tell the truth, even when I didn't deserve it. And thank you for standing up to Peter when I couldn't. I'm starting over now, trying to rebuild myself piece by piece. I hope one day I'll be strong enough to face you and truly apologize for everything. You deserve a fresh start, Marcus. You always have. I hope this is the beginning of something better for you. Evelyn." He folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope. There was a hollow ache in his chest, but it wasn't the sharp pain of betrayal anymore. It was softer now, a wound beginning to heal. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked gently. Marcus nodded, meeting her gaze. "Yeah, just closing a chapter." Later that day, Marcus stood at the edge of a sprawling construction site. The air was filled with the sounds of progress, hammers, drills, the hum of heavy machinery. He'd decided to invest in a community project, building affordable housing for families like Sarah's who needed a hand up. Javier approached, his weathered face breaking into a grin. "Didn't think I'd ever see you on this side of a construction site," he teased. Marcus chuckled. "First time for everything." Javier clapped him on the back. "You're doing good work here, Delaney. Real good work." As the day wore on, Marcus felt a quiet pride growing within him. He'd spent so much of his life chasing success, building an empire that he thought would bring him fulfillment. But standing here, surrounded by the tangible results of his efforts to make a difference, he realized that success meant nothing without purpose. That evening, Marcus drove home as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. The house was quieter now, but it no longer felt empty. He poured himself a glass of wine, sitting on the porch and watching the stars emerge one by one. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to simply breathe. The battles he had fought, the lies, the betrayals, the losses, had left their scars. But they had also forged something stronger within him. This was a new beginning. And as Marcus stared into the night, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope.